Hello and welcome back to the From My Perspective podcast, where I, Jackson McCarty, tell you all the names you need to know in the college football landscape that could change the football landscape in the very near future. So, for this upcoming season and for really the next two seasons, there's going to be a lot of changing in college football. The Big 12 is getting changed drastically. They're getting 4 new teams this season, and then directly after that, they're going to change drastically again because they're losing most likely their 2 largest brands within the conference, Oklahoma and Texas, because they're going to the SEC. My goal today is to look at both groups of teams that are going to be moving, both the group that's moving to the SEC next season and the soon-to-be Big 12 teams, and tell you how I believe they fare moving into that, transitional period. Before we jump into any of that, make sure you hit like, make sure you hit subscribe. It helps me out a ton. I'm just trying to grow the channel. So I'm going to start with the one that's the farthest away, primarily because I think it's going to have the biggest ripple effect in college football as a whole, and that is the movement of Oklahoma and Texas going to the SEC next season. Now, I'm going to look at how both these teams fare from an individual perspective, as well as how the rest of the conference fares. The SEC as soon as these two teams arrive. And we start with Oklahoma, who I think if you've been watching this podcast very much, you would know that I'm not just the highest on. Last year entirely, I did not really see the appeal with them preseason. Turned out to be right in that regard. Had a lot of OU fans jumping up my crawl about saying that they might be a 7-win program, and it turns out I wasn't too far off on that one. From a recruiting standpoint, it's always going to be an improvement for teams like Oklahoma and Texas whenever you move, quote unquote, up in conferences. Now, granted, yes, the Big 12 is a Power 5 conference, but the SEC has this aura around it that is pretty undeniable. I think very few people would say that that many conferences at all, if any, are on the same level as SEC football is. And you can see that by the recruiting rankings annually. A lot of SEC programs finish very high up on those lists, whereas not a whole lot of other conferences have that much all-around success as the SEC does. There's a lot more to this puzzle, though. It's not just about the kids you can bring in. I mean, we saw Texas A&M, last year have one of the best recruiting classes of all time, but that's not where the puzzle stops. You have to make sure to use all these guys and put them in place, and it's not as if OU is some perfect team by any means. While OU has one more season to really get into shape and figure out what they want to be, their defensive head coach didn't bring a whole lot of defense with him from Clemson. Last year, OU's defense was definitely not the pinnacle or, what we thought it could be under Coach Brent Venables, and I've got some numbers to back that up. The Sooners allowed 30 points 7 times last year, over 30 points, I should say. They allowed the 13th most pass yards per game in the country and the 26th most rush yards per game in the country. Those numbers don't get you very far in the SEC. It's because those defenses are a lot better than Big 12 defense, so you've got to be able to hold your water and not rely every single game on trying to keep up with some of the most high-powered offenses in the country. There's some interesting pieces being added to the Sooners in the portal. Rondell Bothroyd, Devon Sears, Dason McCullough, Jacob Lacey, but I can't say for sure it's going to work. That's a lot of defensive line help, which I do think is promising, and I think that's the right thing to look at and to really fortify as you go to the SEC, because a really good D-line can do a lot of things for you. It can help kind of blind the offense to how weak your coverage might be, and it can give the linebackers some slack, so to speak, if that rush is getting home and making plays. I just don't know that those guys are going to be enough. If Brent Venables can use these new guys to create a strong defensive line, then I'm going to have a decent amount of confidence that OU can get to about 8-ish wins, 7, 8 wins in the SEC in their first year. But, beyond that, I don't know how comfortable I am in their projection. I mean, if they can't figure out that defense, and it looks pretty similar to what it did last year, there's reason to expect that they could be a 6-win school in the SEC. And that's not just me being, an OU hater or anything like that. But if your schedule consists of, Tennessee, Florida, Bama, Georgia, whoever, because we don't know how the pod system is going to work or the conference system or what they're going to do. But if you get this amalgamation of truly quality teams that we've seen do a lot of damage to, high-ranking schools outside of the SEC, do you really have a whole lot of confidence that your first year of facing that full slate is going to get you very far? I don't personally. So OU is actually, surprisingly enough, one of my more favorable outlooks for, of the two that are going to the SEC, but it's still not particularly favorable. So that kind of tips my hand a little bit for this next team we're going to talk about, Texas. I think that they're going to be good this upcoming season. I don't really love their overall outlook moving forward. I think that they've got plenty of cool pieces, like Quinn Ewers is good. Obviously, Arch Manning's going to make some kind of impact whenever they move to the SEC, unless he transfers, which I don't really think is going to be the case. But they really did lose their offense, which was Bijan Robinson last year. He's going to the NFL. Odds are he's going to be a first-round pick. You've got to do a serious redesign of this offense to figure things out and to really get yourself into shape for next year in the SEC. And full discretion, I'm not really sold on Steve Sarkisian or the Longhorns program as a whole. When you look at their transfer portal, you got Jalen Catalon, Gavin Holmes, Adonai Mitchell. They should play solid roles at the bare minimum, important roles at the maximum, but it doesn't feel like they reloaded the rest of the roster very well. The secondary should be pretty well off, and maybe you have that other receiving option there, but I feel like you're missing the plot a little bit with what you look to attack and what maybe you couldn't get into the building because other teams were drawing them away from you. Texas's recruiting, I don't think really takes much of a boost because that brand is already so well established. Like kids that grow up in Texas, while the Aggies are there and you've got TCU now who just got made to the college football playoff, and SMU used to be a really good brand, and granted not in the kids that are being recruited now's lifetime, but I don't think that it changes much because most of the kids from Texas typically, unless they go out of state or are trying to leave the state of Texas, want to be a Longhorn. So I don't know that the SEC really boosts them any other than maybe to some exterior states that also kind of find themselves fascinated with the brand because brands matter a lot more than you think they do. Sometimes they rival, the success factor, which we saw with Arch Manning. You don't have to be the most successful program to land incredible recruits, and Texas should still be able to do that and maybe get a little bit of a bump outside of their typical states that they recruit from. I think next year could be a 9-win year for them. I really do think that in the Big 12, how everything is coming together, that they could be a 9-win program, finish second or third in the conference, start feeling really good. But the overall future outlook of this team definitely has me concerned because a lot of places it doesn't really feel to me, and I'm not a Texas expert, I'm not, really just super well versed in their depth chart or what their plans are necessarily, but I don't think that there is an overall structure right now to the team. I think Sarkisian is trying to make it through his years and try to get to the next one as opposed to trying to get to year 4, year 5, year 6 and really building a program that he feels he can rely on. It feels more like he's trying to obtain short-term success that hopefully builds into long-term success. So obviously those two teams, they will have the task of moving to the SEC, but they're not the only ones that are going to be affected by this move, obviously. There are 3 groups that I divided the SEC conference as it stands currently into that upper echelon, that middle of the pack, and the seller teams that, really are struggling and don't really have much footing in the conference that I want to see how they are affected by these moves. And we start with the upper echelon, which I would consider Georgia, Alabama, LSU. I think if Tennessee reloads properly, they could be up there. And I also think Ole Miss, just on a consistency and how well Lane Kiffin is at this whole coaching thing, I think that they belong in that upper echelon. I don't think that they get too affected. Like Ole Miss might suffer just a touch, or Tennessee might struggle a little bit in recruiting in those states now. But I think that for the most part, their records and their standings won't be very, harmed, but I think that their pockets will get even deeper from this move, obviously, because when you get to play teams like Oklahoma and Texas, no matter what you think about their conference, no matter what you think about the actual rosters, they're big brands, they get big money, people pay to watch them, people go at home and watch them. That's just the nature of college football and the nature of those two teams. It's hard to say that Alabama, Georgia, LSU are going to be affected by these teams because there's not really a clear roadmap as to how those teams truly stack up to the SEC and challenge, in the early portions of their tenure. So I think, at least for the first 2 or 3 years, unless there's a drastic change to one of these programs, none of that collection of teams that I just mentioned should be impacted too much as far as where they stand in the standings. Now, we move to the middle of the pack, which I would consider Arkansas, Auburn, Florida, A&M, Mississippi State, South Carolina, and Kentucky. Now, all of those outside of South Carolina and Kentucky have a lot of value, or more value, I guess, than South Carolina and Kentucky do in the states that are moving in, Oklahoma and Texas. So recruiting could take a pretty sizable hit for some of these programs. I'm looking more at Arkansas and Mississippi State than I am anything else. I think A&M's got too much money. Florida's too big of a brand. Auburn, they can, kind of stick to the inside of Alabama and be fine. But Arkansas and Mississippi State do kind of have to go outside of their states to find the kids that will change their program. And I think that the states that they typically look at, which are Oklahoma and Texas, are going to become significantly harder to recruit in. You look at South Carolina and Kentucky, they could lose a little bit of footing, definitely as far as building brands, because this could see them slip around in the standings, but I don't think that their recruiting and transfers will be directly impacted by those states coming into the conference. I think it'll be more so because there's not a sustained model of success there, and they're not big enough brands that can really, grab a lot of recruits and transfers to get into the program and help build a consistent base. So that's a little concerning for them, but I do think that this middle of the pack group is what gets hit the hardest by far in the conference. And then we move to the cellar, which I kept it to 2 teams. It's Missouri and it's Vandy. I don't think they get impacted too much because I don't really think they can go much lower than where they're already at. Of course, their numbers will be lower, and of course that their records might look worse because, Texas and OU might put up significant numbers on them while they're lower in the conference and yada yada. But I don't think that public appearance and public opinion of them is going to change a whole lot from this move. So, it's relatively unimpacted. I just don't know that they have what it takes to move up anyways. So adding more kind of in that middle of the road section shouldn't really harm them, or it won't harm them any more than they're already being harmed by being in the SEC. I'll put it that way. So that's how I see the SEC shaking out when these 2 teams move over. We'll do a check back in on this probably next offseason, or at least when the season concludes. So, or we head into bowl season, because I want to, give it whatever that is, 8, 9, 10, 11 months to let it set, let them, kind of prove in a sense what they have planned for this move to the SEC before I put my final stamp on it. But as of right now, that's what I'm thinking of these teams. Now we move to the conference that Texas and OU will be abandoning, which is the Big 12, and they are getting 4 new teams from a collection of different conferences. Well, one conference and then the independents, but we start with the independent team today because BYU, both alphabetically and just brand-wise, I think is the largest of the 4 that's coming in, and it's going to be a tough move for them strictly because when you're coming off of losing a quarterback as talented and as successful as Jaren Hall was, it's never going to be easy for your program to get right, in a sense, because Jaren Hall was truly very prominent in BYU's success over the past 2 years. Started those 2 years, 51 touchdowns, 5,700 yards, 18 wins. I think you take that, especially if you're BYU. I think you just need some variance of success, and you were coming off Zach Wilson, the year prior to Jaren Hall coming in, so it was already going to be kind of tough, but Jaren Hall did a really good job of stepping up and getting himself solidified and, making sure people knew that the quarterback position was not a con, in a sense. It was not a negative or an easy thing to to exploit when you played the Cougars. They brought in Keaton Slovis, which, adds adds experience to the quarterback room, but it's hard to convince yourself that he's going to be the quarterback that we once thought he was going to be. I mean, his performances have gotten worse every year. Pitt last year was hard to watch at times, so moving to BYU, moving to the Big 12, gives him more leniency, I'd say, on defense, because the Big 12 is not revered for their defensive style of football, in 2023 at least, but you still, I don't personally have just a ton of confidence that he's all the way where we thought he could be, or at least, might have to climb some mental hurdles to get to a point much closer to those previous expectations. I will say they might have enough guys outside of that to be solid. Aiden Robbins and the Boise duo that they got in the portal look like they could contribute to the team in the first year. And Kalani Sitake's a good enough head coach that I think he can bring out a lot of quality in his roster, especially with the motivational fuel, if you will, that is going to be provided by moving to the Big 12, because moving to a new conference, thinking you're the underdogs, that has a lot to do with success, because if you can convince your team that nobody thinks they're good enough, and they are a group of individuals who think like, okay, I need to go prove this person wrong, then you can reap benefits from that. Absolutely. I mean, we saw it at least we think we saw it from what Kirby Smart was saying with Georgia this year when they won the Natty, because everybody kept saying nobody thought Georgia could win the Natty. If you can convince your players that nobody thinks that they're going to be, worthwhile, they think they're an FCS school, or they think they're, even lower than that, you can certainly draw some from that. And with Sitake's, already talented abilities as a head coach, I think they should be all right in that regard. They're definitely not my front runner for the best debut in the Big 12, but they're certainly not my lowest either. Now, I don't know. I'm kind of in a toss-up between these next two that we'll talk about as to who will be my lowest Big 12 debutante. I find it a little difficult to really figure out who actually has what it takes here, mostly because in Cincinnati's case, we don't know what they have. They went through an absolute doomsday scenario, losing Luke Fickell, losing a ton of their players to just moving elsewhere in the portal, and now they've brought in Scott Satterfield to be their head coach, who does have P5 experience, but it's not as if his Louisville teams were, setting the world on fire. Louisville has been pretty kind of in the middle of the pack for the past few years that he's been there. So I don't have just a ton of confidence in him moving forward, but apparently Cincy does, because they were willing to put him at the helm of the team as they move into a new conference. Moving to the Power 5 without Fickell around is going to be difficult, like I mentioned. So it's all about what they can build in year one, kind of on the fly, with, all these different changes happening around the program, with one of those changes being the schedule that they play against arguably, with the teams that are coming with them, inarguably a better schedule. You could have some semblance of confidence if this was coming off the back of the playoff year. Even if Fickell left, you're still going to have some guys who hung over from that are very talented, that are, going to be impact players, that are going to make noise in the conference. But this was far from the peak of Cincy football, and I don't think that we see that really return under Satterfield, because Fickell is a better head coach than Satterfield is, at least in my opinion. You can, if you've got a different one, you can argue with me all you want, but I think that that's a pretty universal thought, that Fickell is a better head coach than Satterfield. I think that, a lot of this roster is pretty uninspiring, or it's at least unproven in a lot of spots. Their quarterback situation, being either Ben Bryant or Emory Jones, is a very scary, thought for me. I don't feel confident in either one of those guys at all. So that's going to be interesting, because I think finding a quarterback fixes, or at least helps to move towards a fix in a lot of issues. I don't think that they have their true quarterback on this roster. I like to think of this bit of like two trains hitting head on, because you've got one, your stable force and your true balancing act of a head coach is leaving, so that's running one way on the tracks, and then moving up in conference and moving up, on your schedule and who you have to play coming the other way on the tracks. They're going to hit head on. As to what happens when that happens, I don't really know yet. Maybe Satterfield comes out and shocks me and takes Cincy to 8 or 9 wins in their first year, and they're, potentially in the Big 12 championship game, and this, that, and the other. It's possible. It's football. We play football for a reason. It's because we don't truly know what's going to happen until it happens. But I don't have very much confidence, and I have them tentatively at my fourth spot. But I do think Houston has a case as well, who we are talking about next, which, I just got done rattling on and on about how I think since these struggles come from a lack of proof and a lack of real substance that we can grab onto and gravitate to, whereas I think one of the very few things going in Houston's direction is the fact that Dana Holgorsen is still with the program, because he is a proven guy. I think that he deserves a lot of respect as a head coach, and I think that he is going to keep his team above that very bottom line, just because he is a good enough head coach to get himself out of those kinds of waters. But again, their program was shaky at best this year, and they're losing a very important piece in Clayton Tune, and I don't think that they have an immediate guy moving forward that can replace him. I think rolling with Donovan Smith's Big 12 experience, because last year he was at Texas Tech, is probably Houston's best option, at least to open the year. But I think it's kind of dicey outside of that. I mean, even their portal group was not the most inspiring thing I've ever looked at. You can see a couple decent contributors here and there, but it's not like it's setting the world on fire by any means. It's pretty middle of the road, which I don't think does enough for you whenever you're moving up conferences like this to bring much inspiration and to bring much hope to teams, or to people who are looking at this from an outside perspective and trying to figure out where you're going to finish. I think middle of the road, kind of middle of the pack, is the most likely finish for the Cougars. Maybe they can get kind of that tier 2, if you will, like that 7-8 win section, a decent conference record. Maybe you drop a couple out of conference where you're like, okay, it's a good enough start to where you're not just too nervous about it, or you're not too broken up about how your team did. But realistically, I've got 7 wins, a pretty average conference record, and just kind of a shrug of the shoulders, just you did what you could start, and maybe they'll move towards building a better base within the coming years. I think that their future outlook, just because of Dana Holgorsen, is a lot better than Cincinnati's, but I think that their starting point right now is lower than that. So, you see what I'm saying? Like, it's hard to pick between those two for me personally as to who's going to struggle the most with this move, but unquestioned, who my number one team is, the best chance to succeed year one in the Big 12, UCF. I mean, they really do have a lot of great things going for them right now, starting at the top with their head coach, Gus Malzahn. He knows how to coach true Power 5 ball. He was at Auburn for a number of years. He knows how to get it done in these big conferences. You look at their quarterback, John Reese Plumlee, took a major step up this year. I was very impressed. I was a skeptic through and through of John Reese Plumlee's move to UCF. I thought Mikey Keene would beat him out for that job. I thought Mikey Keene would be the reason they were successful. That while Mikey Keene was not bad, he did end up transferring, but Mikey Keene was not a bad quarterback. John Reese Plumlee was just a better one for UCF, which I really didn't see coming. You still got Kobe Hudson, Isaiah Bowser. They're coming back to help build some of that continuity. There's plenty of other guys out there as well. Those are just the two that I'm really drawn to for this team. They snagged a few cast-offs from those big schools that typically send 24 stars out into the portal every year just because they don't have a spot, a clear spot to the top. So I think they got a kid from Alabama. They might have got a kid from Georgia. I don't 100% remember. I didn't write their names down, but they got some of those cast-offs that have plenty of talent good enough to get to those big schools, but just needing a place to show it off. So they got that. They got some other, kind of middle of the pack schools, kids that just need a better opportunity to succeed, that more or less will fill out the numbers, probably not get a bump or a sizable bump in their production or their role, but should at least give you more options of guys that you can go to. I think UCF underperformed last year, and they still got 9 wins. I think that program could have been a 10 or 11 win program last year. You can look at their schedule and see where those slip-ups really happened and where they could have fixed it. But 9 wins for them I thought was an underperformance, and while I do again think that their conference schedule is going to get harder, you got to think about what's around them. TCU, Kansas State, and Texas all look weaker than they did last year. and you have to expect them to figure it out and, improve. And I don't think all three of them can do it. So why can't UCF slot into one of their spots and finish top three in the conference and really become a playmaker and a team to watch within the Big 12 as soon as they arrive? I think that that's what we're headed for with the Knights, but we have to wait and see, which we all will be doing next season because they will be playing in that conference, and I'm very excited to see what the Big 12 looks like after these four teams join. But do you have a different opinion than me? Do you think one of these teams will succeed a lot better than I'm saying? You think one of these teams will be a lot worse than I'm saying? Feel free to hop in the comment section below, talk with me about it. I'd love to chat, and I like to see what you think. So make sure to get in the comment section for that. But this has been episode 61 of the From My Perspective podcast. And as always, I'll see you next time.